Thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmark. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club that takes place on the first Tuesday of every month. Our sessions cover an array of engineering and leadership books that our awesome Lead Dev audience can draw insights and practical experiences from. I'm Suzan Bond, and I'm your moderator. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and a leadership consultant. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter at Suzan Bond or on my website, constellaryhq.com. Today, we'll be talking about how to be right when it counts. If you have questions for Sho, please pop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom. Sho is a passionate, dynamic, technical leader with more than 15 years of industry experience in banking, retail, and marketing, ads, and the social media domain. So many. He has a proven track record of aligning technology strategy to desired business outcomes. His passion is connecting people, systems, information, and data. His creative pursuits include writing, speaking, and building relevance-powered consumer apps focusing on deepening connections amongst friends and the world around them. I don't know what that is, but that sounds really fascinating. Welcome to the show, Sho.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. It's such an honor to be able to sit with you today, Suzan. And I love everything that Lead Dev does and represents. And yeah, I'm so glad to be here today.
Yeah, we're great to have you. Lead Dev is great. It's such a great organization. And I love it when more people discover it. And then people like you come and share their wisdom with us. So I'm curious about, what inspired you to write this book? What was sort of the genesis of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. As a technologist working in the data science and machine learning space, I've always been intrigued with what goes into making good predictions. Over the last few years, I've supported efforts to build models aimed at doing just that. This got me curious about what goes into making good decisions, essentially. So that began my research and reflection on what could be learned in this art of making good decisions. The product of that today is the book. So I really was more than anything else, was really curiosity in trying to understand, how do you go about making good predictions?
And I love that idea. I'm so sorry for the sirens, everybody, New York City living. It's really interesting. I mean, I should have thought of this before, but this idea of like predictions versus decision making, I'm curious, even how you might define them or how you use those words and think about predictions as it comes to decision making and data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, every decision you're making, you're sort of making a prediction that you're going to have the right outcome or a favorable outcome. And you're also basing that decision of some information that you have available at the time, as well as historical information. It's very similar to what systems do. In this case, in the example I mentioned, along the lines of machine learning models, which is an area and space that I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years. You essentially are trying to take historical data and information at hand, and you're trying to make predictions. So that was what got me really curious, is how close is the art of actually making accurate predictions to actually making good decisions.
Love that. That's so great. So what made you name the book How to Be Right When It Counts? And what do you mean by that when you name that book?
Right.
And you talk about it in the book, but for people who haven't read it.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone will probably agree with this, that not all decisions are made equal, right? Sometimes the outcomes carry a lot of weight, and at other times they are quite inconsequential. Much like deciding to marry the right person. That is a big decision that you want to make, and so you want to put a lot of thought into it. In that situation, maybe it counts. You want to be right as best as possible. Versus choosing the right shoe to wear, today. Yeah, you probably have different options to wear, but the consequence is more inconsequential. So when it counts is really important. Ultimately, one of those decisions in the example has a higher stake and the other maybe doesn't. And you want, and it's still kind of subjective, in terms of how you process that information. The key takeaway really is that the habits we build around making small decisions could rub off on how we make bigger decisions. So it's really trying to think about, I want to be right, but when is it really important? And how do I go about, doing when it does count? What do I need to do to ensure that I'm trying to achieve a favorable outcome?
Yeah, I love that. And you said something in there that's really interesting, which is like these small decisions, how they can add up to add an effective around big decisions. Can you just say a little bit more about that? And I know you talk about it in the book, but I'd just love to get a little bit more about that.
Right. So there are decisions that we make that seem like small decisions and feel inconsequential. So I just give an example of I want to pick a shirt. I picked the shirt to wear today. I could have worn any other shirt. However, there are decisions that build on themselves. A decision in terms of how I choose to eat. My decision to go out for a walk and make a habit out of it. And sometimes, those decisions build on each other, and at the end of the day, they kind of like a sum, where a sum of all the prior decisions we've made, if you think about it. And so if we think of decision making in that form and light, even the small decisions then become meaningful in some cases, because ultimately they build on themselves. And you absolutely want to think about where you want to be long term in order to make the right decisions now.
Yeah, I mean, because there's like, and it's hard too, because sometimes we don't always see when it's going to be a big decision, and like that our additive goes up over time, right? I mean, let's just think about a very simple concept with technical debt. If you think about it in the technical space, right? We might end up with technical debt over time because of these small inconsequential decisions that we didn't really
Right.
sort of think about.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely true. Even when it comes to how you build your reputation at work, I feel like trust and reputation has a lot to do with consistency and credibility. And if you don't if you don't think about how you show up and how you appear to work, to your teammates in terms of how your timeliness in responding to emails, getting things done, completing it, your thoroughness in reviewing your peers' code, it starts to build up. And there's an impression and a reputation that you build over time. So even the little things and decisions you make in terms of work and in life, it starts to build up into how you're perceived. Even though it's not actually what you're aspiring towards, it ends up being, who you are to other people.
Yeah, I love that. All right, I want to turn us a little bit, because you have a fair amount of experience in machine learning, or lots of experience, I should say, really.
Yeah.
And what have you learned about how it relates with how we make decisions?
No, that's a good point. I talked about this, made reference to this a little bit ago. But like I said, machine learning is built on the premise that you can take a body of data and create a model of that data, which you can then use to make predictions about the future. Even a lot of buzz around ChatGPT that we have today, the large language models, is essentially what it's doing. It's taking a large body of text, and you've created a language model that tries to predict the next word that comes. It's basically based on that idea. Today, these models can help predict if an email is spam or not spam, or if a patient is likely to have cancer or not. And that's how powerful the idea of big data applied to machine learning is today. It's actually no different from us. Like I highlighted before, we form mental models of past experiences that shape our ability to predict outcomes. And this plays in how we make decisions ultimately.
I love it. That idea of like these mental models, like machine learning, there are mental models that go into them. And just like us as humans, we have mental models that go into decision making.
Right.
And it's sort of like about also like, how do we reveal those mental models in some ways? Because sometimes I think we're operating with a mental model and we're not even aware of it.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, and some of the things I talk about in the book highlights that the reason why we need to check some of those things and things that we can do to position ourselves to inspect the mental models that we have.
Yeah, really important. Because I think a lot of times we don't really know that they're operating and that they're having such an influence. We just think it's the way the world is, rather than it's the perspective that maybe I'm bringing to the world, which is Anise Nin, I love to say this quote, we don't see the world the way it is, we see the world the way we are.
That's
And
true.
even that simple truth of recognizing that. So that's
Yeah,
something that
absolutely.
I quote that quote a lot. It's really important to me just to remember that I think sometimes we get into arguments about like, no, this is the right decision. No, this is the right decision. This is the right decision with a capital T. And we forget that there's a perspective operating there. And maybe
Very,
there
very
isn't
true.
always one right decision. I don't know. Sometimes there are, but sometimes there aren't.
Yeah, that's true. And I think this kind of speaks to the value of having diversity of thought in the workplace is you're able to bring those different perspectives and highlight maybe potential blind spots.
Yeah, that's so good. I want to talk about some of the things that you introduced. You talk in the book about one-way and two-way doors. Can you tell me what you mean by those one-way and two-way doors and what the difference is between these kinds of decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to say that I learned about one-way and two-way doors from Jeff Bezos and my time working at Amazon. That was when I really got introduced to the concept and also got immersed into it. Two-way doors are decisions that are easily reversible. So you walk through the door and you can walk right back through that door. It's a two-way door, right? Such as a decision such as buying a TV or a dress from a store that has a return policy. That's essentially a two-way door. I can get it and I can change my mind about it. It's easily reversible. If you don't like it, you can return it. One-way doors are decisions that are harder to reverse. You have a baby, that's not a decision you can easily undo, right? Once you understand this, you begin to spot a lot of such decisions in work and in life. So those are some things that I think describe the differences between a one-way door versus a two-way door. Is the idea that a one-way door is harder to reverse and two-way doors are easily reversible decisions.
Well, so I think we might approach two-way door decision making differently, right? What are some of the things that to keep in mind when it comes to the one-way door decision making? How do we help people sort of think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the danger that I've seen, especially when it comes to work and being a leader, is the danger of teams and individuals or people and us approaching one-way door like two-way doors and vice versa. You're treating two-way doors like one-way doors. And so one of the things I've tried to do, especially with my teams, is if I see us, stumbling and it's taking a while to make a decision, it's fair to ask that question: is this a one-way door, a two-way door? And I find that when it's a two-way door, you want to optimize for speed because you want to learn as quickly as you can. And because it's a two-way door, you afford the ability for you to be able to actually make a decision and learn from it and reverse it. And so you don't want to expend a lot of energy. You don't want to expend a lot of time. But with one-way doors, you want to be deliberate. If I'm choosing a cloud infrastructure for my company or for a specific program that I'm working with at work, and a lot of data is going to be going there, the cost of switching is maybe not always easy, and it's going to be hard to reverse. And so you might want to try it as a one-way door. Now, there are things that you can do to make one-way doors feel like more like two-way doors. So the example I gave to you about cloud solution, you could do like a POC, right? So you have a way to experiment and to learn and to try and figure things out. So there are ways in which you can explore one-way doors and quickly learn from it. A good example of this and how I applied in my personal life in terms of two-way doors and one-way doors is when I travel and I make stay reservations or hotel reservations. Usually I pay close attention to the cancellation policies as well as, if I have to pay upfront. When I realize that, when I have the option, when I know the cancellation is far out and I don't have to pay upfront, it actually treated like a two-way door. So I actually book a couple of places and I give myself time to actually get as much information to be able to optimize for the right decision. So that's just an example. But the key thing is being able to be conscious and realize that not all decisions are made the same way. And there might be some decisions that require more deliberation, and some you just need to make it as quickly as possible.
Well, and I love just even that simple thing of like identifying it. This is a one-way or a two-way door. Sometimes, I mean, listen, I mean, I do the same thing. I was literally just booking a vacation and I understood that concept. I did the same thing around, okay, I can cancel this time and this one, you know. But I think sometimes when we get into business or technical conversations, the idea of one-way and two-way doors sort of goes out of our head, and we don't maybe
Yes.
necessarily recognize, you know what I mean? Maybe we get too immersed in the details. So I love that the naming of that, and that for a two-way
Yep.
door, you want to optimize for speed, right? It's like why we maybe getting stuck in analysis paralysis on a two-way door
Exactly.
is not ideal. But what
Yeah.
would you say, and maybe you said this and I just didn't catch it because it's like been such a rich conversation, but what do you think we want to optimize in a one-way door? Does it, or
Yeah.
does it
What we want
change based on what we're looking at, what the decision is?
Yeah, I think there's a tenet that I've embraced when it comes to one-way doors. Ultimately, like a lot of decisions in life, we need to understand that we cannot get all the information that we need. But we want to be in a place where we understand the costs of that decision, and we want to be mindful of the risks that are associated with it. And so what you want to do is you want to be right long term, but you also want to be reasonable in the near term. And so when it comes to one-way doors, there's an aspect of really thinking about what is the right thing long term, and what are the things that are going to make this hard for me to reverse. Is it impact on my users or impact on my customers, or is it a financial cost? Like, what makes this a hard decision, and how can I be aware of that and keep track of that, so that as I navigate and as I make that decision and execute, I'm able to adjust appropriately along the way. Sometimes we don't have enough information and we have to do the very best, but realizing that it's a decision you don't want to rush into, allows you to be more intentional about how you make that decision to get as much detail and perspective as possible.
That's so great. I also really love what you said about right long term, but also reasonable short term. It's this idea that like also time scales. What are we optimizing for in
Exactly.
time scales? And when it maybe in the short term, ouch, this is going to hurt, but how much does it hurt for this
Yep,
long term vision that we see? That's kind of what I hear you saying in there.
that's correct. That's right. Absolutely.
I love that. I'm like, I really wish I had this when I was a leader. I had this framework of one-way and two-way doors, because I felt like
Yes.
sometimes we spent too much time, maybe not enough time on one-way doors because we couldn't see that it was a one-way door. We didn't really mention that, no one called that out. And
Right.
maybe sometimes too much time on two-way doors. So I'm
Exactly.
like, I'm taking notes for, if I was ever in that situation again, it's super helpful. So you have this interesting thing when it comes to maybe decision making or sharing a decision you've made, that you like to ask people to tell you why you're mistaken if they disagree with you.
Right.
And it's not like an aggressive thing at all, but
Mhm.
it's, you actually have really interesting nuance about it. So I wonder if you could tell us more about like why you seek opposing opinions. Like, why is that important?
Absolutely. The reality is we all have blind spots. Even the best drivers with rear view mirrors, side mirrors have blind spots.
Yep.
And by seeking disagreeable opinions, you help shine light to something you may have missed. And so I realized that as a leader, you need to be conscious of the fact that there are things that you can't see and you don't have a strong view on, and that there might be opinions that you may have that might be misinformed. If you think about it, there are
Mm.
probably some things you felt strongly about years ago that you've changed your mind on. By that point in time, you felt so strongly about it. And it's going back to that point of how seeking disagreeable opinions actually speeds up that process. There's just something that happened just in the past week that has to do with if a week ago, if you have asked me, Sho, do you think it's a good idea to slap an API as a way to interface with big data? I would have had an emotional and very strong reaction. I said, I don't know if that's a good pattern that we want to probably explore. But because I realized and I was trying to apply this principle what I did was I kept an open mind, and I reached out to two people that I trust who had a different opinion than I did. And I listened to them and I said, tell me why you think I'm wrong. Explain to me and help me understand your position. And believe it or not, I'm actually in the process of changing my mind on that specific topic. But ultimately, the goal is to be right long term, right? And if you admit the fact that you have blind spots and people you trust that are experts who have disagreeable opinion can provide that input for you and help you see those things you don't see. So I feel like it's very, very beneficial to do that. Look for trusted people who have good intentions that maybe have disagreeable opinions. It helps you basically see things that you probably may have missed.
Yeah, it also strikes me when you say blind spots that it's also taking the ego out of it. And I don't mean ego in like, oh, they have such a big ego sort of way, but we all have ego, which is this conglomeration of the way we see the world and all that. And so it's sort of like, when you ask that question, it sounds like you're trying to take your ego out of it so that you can be more maybe objective rather than subjective.
That's exactly what it is. It's realizing that it's a little bit of humility, is the fact that no one knows everything, and part of learning is changing your opinion on things or growing in general. So for me, I think it's just like a shortcut. It's a way to be able to get to the right answer a lot better.
Well, yeah, and when you say that, again, I'm like having all these really good insights. But what it occurs to me underneath that too is that there's it's not that just that you want to be right, but that you want to learn. It's sort of like machine learning. Machine learning learns as it goes. You want to be a human learning as you go, so that I assume that maybe I guess you want to learn as you go so that you make better decisions in the future.
Absolutely. And the reality is, even seeking disagreeable opinions is not a guarantee that your opinions will change, but I can guarantee you're going to learn something you didn't know before.
Yeah, I wondered, like, I'm sure you don't have does it happen sometimes? Is it 50-50? Like, how often do you think you change your mind of that versus you learn something new?
Believe it or not, I actually said this in the book, and I believe strongly that people who are right a lot actually change their mind a lot. And I think it has a lot to do with learning, essentially. So I feel that I've not kept track to be able to think back. I know with my wife, I definitely changed my mind a lot. So I've definitely learned. But absolutely, I do think that there are things that I would never have learned or understood if I did not have people around me with disagreeable opinions.
Well, yeah, and sometimes I think I'll do that too. I'm really open to other people's points of view, and sometimes it may not change my mind, but it rounds out the conversation and adds a nuance to it. Yes. Or if this, then that, right? If in that situation, then I might do that, right? Rather than having such a maybe rigid view on something.
Yeah, and even in the book, I give an example how the Wright brothers, who built the first airplane, how whenever they were arguing on a design or an approach, they would always, after they argue for one side of the argument, they take turns and they switch to the other side, and then they argue for the opposing opinion. Because then when you put yourself in another person's shoes, it helps you to start to think and rationalize through things in terms of, is this more of an emotional feeling or is this based on something truly rational? So there's tremendous benefits in just being able to think differently about things.
That's so good. So good. Okay. You also talk about, and you kind of mentioned this, having muses that you call on decision making. What do you mean by this, and what's the importance of these muses in your decision making process?
Yeah, so the idea of a muse kind of is inspired by Greek mythology, this idea of muses that basically inspire you and give you inspiration. The reality is, no matter how smart or a good a decision maker you are, you're not often afforded time and opportunity to learn enough about a domain or situation to make a good decision. And you could be on a new job, gaining contexts, or you could be under a time constraint and you don't have all the information available and accessible to you. This is where I found muses come in handy for me. And in terms of how I use muses specifically, I think of them as people that could give me perspective that I don't have, and they may have
Mm,
knowledge in certain areas that can give me insight, and I can quickly get there very quickly. A good example of places where I've used muses is an area, a recreational area of interest for me is fantasy football. Yes, I
mm,
watch a lot of American football, but I don't know all the nitty-gritty details. And in order for me to be able to do well when I do that with my friends, I actually have people I consider muses who I follow, and they have recommendations on how to approach the game and approach, playing fantasy football. They can come in handy even at work. When you come to a new place, a new domain, you don't have enough context, you're trying to come up to speed, and you have to make decisions very quickly. You need those muses at your corner to make good decisions.
And well, and like, so how do you decide which muse to trust? Let's say it's an area of expertise outside of what you know, which is a great reason to have
Yep.
a muse, right? I'm like, I don't know this area, but how do you figure out what are sort of like the green flags or ways that you know who to trust when picking a muse for something?
Yeah, good question. You shouldn't just go to anybody for advice or guidance. I think we all know that. Ideally, your muse should have a track record of being right, and preferably have skin in the game. The latter point
Mm,
is subtle, but it's very, very important. It's easy for people to give you advice when the outcome doesn't impact them in any ways. However, if they are at risk of a downside, if they are wrong, then more weight can be given to their opinion. So it's funny because we watch a lot of talking heads on sports, news, politics all the time, kind of giving their opinions and feeling strongly about it. We often don't pay attention to their track record. How often have they been right about what they're
mm,
saying? And oftentimes, some of them might not even have skin in the game. But these are the people we trust and we get our sources of information from. I find that you're likely to find more reliable muses when you find people that have a track record of being right and they also have skin in the game. If you're a leader in a new organization or a team, and I've done this before, I did this when I've
mm.
made transitions to my new roles. It's okay for you to ask. You can ask people, who has a track record of being right, and finding ways to kind of build relationships with those people. You might also find, especially when you come into a new organization, that they often mention a specific person's name. Oh, we need to talk to John, or we need to talk to
Mm.
Mary. Because even though they might not have a specific title, people have built a level of trust with them in their decision making. So that's a different way to be able to identify potentially people that have a track record of being right.
Well, yeah, and I think that there are an incredible amount of very senior ICs who are like that, right? Who may not have a title that you would recognize. It might be staff or principal or senior, but you may not recognize as an outsider, a new person to the organization, their
Exactly.
expertise or their track record, but other people will point you to them by mentioning this person's name.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
Mm.
You definitely want to be on the lookout and try to make connections to those people early, because they often have mental models, and we've talked about this already, that are maybe a little more accurate and maybe trustworthy in the context of you trying to still understand or build your mental model of how things work.
Mm. Yeah, I find that's true. I love their mental models, just the way they do. They like how to think about the world, that how help you how to think about a decision making process in a certain domain. I got my
Yes.
start in project management. I knew nothing about technology. I've never been a technologist. I found that I could get pretty accurate project estimations. And people said, "How can you do that? You don't understand the technology." And I'm like, "Because I listened to this guy, this one guy, the way
Yes.
he talked about what everybody else said. I just listened to him, and then I asked a lot of questions, and
Yes.
I started listening to their mental models."
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. It's
Yeah.
it's a great way to learn, being able to, I mean, when you think about it, when we read books, when we listen to podcasts, we are collecting mental models. When people interview successful people who have done things that people aspire to do, you're collecting mental models. So I think always be collecting mental models, I think, is a great motto to follow.
Yeah, it's great. So I guess, if we go back to this whole idea of skin in the game. So
Yes.
how do you have confidence making decisions as a leader when you don't have skin in the game?
I think that's a very good question.
You know?
I think the first thing is realizing that you don't have skin in the game, and be humble to realize that um the way your decisions might be experienced is not the same way you think you might be experienced. I think one thing that leaders don't pay a lot of attention to is how their gestures, their words carry a lot of weight with people that they work with. So realizing and intentionally realizing that no, I don't have a skin in the game. So if I take away this tool from my engineers, I don't use the tool day in, day out, but I don't have a perspective on how they will feel about it. So starting with an understanding and intent, I don't have skin in the game, but I want to be confident about my decision. I think it really starts with listening. As a leader, you need to listen. And one principle I try to apply with my teams when I'm in meetings is to speak last, or to say it differently, to voice my opinion last. Even in a place where there's psychological safety, where if that exists, when a leader speaks first or too early, they don't know that they have caused someone on their team with a different opinion to potentially hesitate to share their thoughts. It takes effort. But when I'm able to be patient before I express my thoughts, I realize I learn a lot at times, and I might actually change my opinion in the middle of a conversation. So when I'm in team meetings, I try to think about it. Leaders speak last. And I really want to give them room to share their opinions because I feel like I might learn something. So really the idea of listening is extremely important when you don't have skin in the game to be able to make high confidence decisions. The other thing that I leverage, I think we've talked about already, is making sure that I stay connected with the muses who have skin in the game, as well as seeking disagreeable opinions from people around me and even people that I work with. I think those things are things I try to apply when I don't have skin in the game to help me better assess that I'm making the best decision I can make.
Well, all three of those are so powerful. And I want to go back to the first one because we hadn't talked about it before, but I do agree with you. I don't think as leaders we recognize how much power we have. And if we talk too early, too often, we don't realize that we are actually influencing the decision. And maybe our opinion isn't the most well-informed, especially as you said, we're not using this piece of software. We just have
Right.
opinions from afar. The people who are
Yes.
actually using it might actually have more nuanced opinions or different decisions that they think would work better.
Absolutely. And there's nothing wrong in asking questions. In fact, I believe that asking questions at times is better than actually having an answer. Because at times you can get to the right place by asking the right question. So at times teams feel confident that they're making the right decision or a certain tool is beneficial for them. But as you listen and as you ask questions, it's an opportunity for conversation and then learning across the board. Because definitely the engineers might not have a view or perspective that is long-term or wide that you may have the vantage point of. But the key thing is engaging, and listening is such a very important part of that process.
Oh, love that. Okay, so one of the things you talk about in the book are premortems. So we all know about postmortems, but I was really fascinated with this idea of premortems. Can you talk a
Yes,
little bit about what it is and how you use it?
absolutely. A premortem is when you look out into the future and you imagine failure, and then you work backwards on the reasons why that could have happened. As you tease out the reasons, you want to rank the reasons for failure by impacts. You also want to take into consideration areas of uncertainty, and by uncertainty I mean area where there's you know less about, you don't have enough information, you're not as knowledgeable about, that you need to dive deeper. And then once you have that ranking, then you want to try and address and plan to how you want to mitigate the likelihood of each factor. In essence, it's a way to manage risk around our decisions and outcomes. And some ways that I've applied this is, I came on board to a new organization, into a new space, and we had a project that wasn't moving along as quickly as we wanted to. And so we had seen not as many gains. Some work had been done in the prior quarter, but and I talk about this in the book, we needed to kind of make progress in the upcoming quarter. And one of the tools I used was a pre-mortem. And so I sat with the team, I worked with the team, and we looked ahead 6 months ahead and said, our plans, our goals, our objectives were a complete failure. What is the reasons why we failed? And so we went through, we listed all the reasons and we ranked them. And then we assigned owners to specific things and explored ways to mitigate it. It's interesting because it was also a great opportunity for the team to feel their voice was heard and to feel a sense of ownership towards the accomplishment and the success of the actual work and the project. So I found pre-mortems to be an excellent tool in terms of trying to address and manage risk when it comes to decision making. I've said it before and I believe it. The only thing better than being right at times is being lucky. And I believe pre-mortems increase your chance of being lucky. So it's one of the things I try to keep in mind and I try to apply, especially I find it relevant where there's a lot of cross-functional engagement across teams for different areas. When there's a high degree of complexity and collaboration, there's a lot of things that could go wrong, and you really want to try and dissect and dive as deep as possible.
Oh, that's a really great point, that like the cross-functional, so that you get more voices in early as a way of sort of helping the decision making. Like, you made a decision, now let's dissect it to make sure that to reiterate or iterate on that decision.
Exactly.
I want to do this. I just launched, I'm launching some new things and I'm like, I want to do a pre-mortem. I have it on my list of things to do. So I've never done one, but
Yes.
I'm going to do one. So we just have a few more minutes left. So I'm going to try to squeeze in here a couple more
Okay.
questions. So we have
Sounds
a question from the audience. I'm going to see if I can, do you ever treat a two-way door decision as a one-way once you've taken it? Is there a reason why you might do that?
Yeah. When you get on the other side and you realize it was actually a one-way door. There's sometimes that we think it's a two-way door and you go across and you realize it's a one-way door. And so but that's the beauty of being able to think about it and realize the distinction, because then you realize that you need to make a quick decision. Do I want to revert? If you think about the whole idea of being reasonable short term and being right long term, you buy yourself the opportunity to be able to reverse when possible. So it does happen that way. But the idea, the key thing to be mindful of is just that recognition that not all decisions are the same and you don't want to treat them the same. We don't always get them right, but I believe that by being intentional of distinguishing between a two-way door and a one-way door and how you make decisions, we improve our chances of being right when it counts.
I love that. So now there's a second part to the question. So to that, can we also think about a one-way decision as two-way? For example, design for potential change, maybe around abstraction, architecture.
Absolutely. And that's one of the examples I gave, in terms of selecting cloud technology, is you want to take a one-way door and potentially see if you can break it down to something that allows and enhances for learning. So like a POC, a spike. Those are ways in which you're trying to mitigate the potential of a decision being very costly. So we do things in that way already. It's just that we're not very cognizant, or we don't realize that we are actually making a big decision and we don't do the right things at times. But you absolutely, when you have a one-way door, you might have an opportunity to kind of break it down and dissect it, or to do some early discovery, to dive a little deeper. You want to be intentional and you want to be deliberate, but you want to do as much as possible to learn as early as possible.
I love that. Okay, last question. We just have a few minutes left. I understand you're writing another book. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's about? Give us a little preview.
Yes, it's actually picking up on the theme of this first book. It's a little more philosophical. I do think it has some pragmatic applications as well. So it's like I said, it's picking up on a theme about being right when it counts. What counts more than how you live your life, right? We live our lives and we don't want to live with any regrets. And so what I'm trying to explore in this book is, how can I be right about how I live my life? How can I be right at the end of the day? Essentially exploring this idea of what is the good life. In that book, I touch on the role of money and meaning, and how it plays into exploring the good life. There's actually a website I set up with a poll. I'm doing a little bit of research right now where I'm exploring how people feel if they were to choose between money and meaning, which will be more important to them. So if you want to check it out, you can go to moneyandmeaningbook.com. Once again, it's moneyandmeaningbook.com. And it's probably going to ask for an email, but don't worry, no one is tracking your email or using your email. It's just to identify you as a unique user. And you can vote, and the plan is to see across the world how people feel about money and meaning. But that's what the book is exploring, is if the most important decision I can be making is how I live my life, and what I'm pursuing is the good life. What is the good life, and how do I, optimize for discovering and actually living out the good life?
I love that. I'm dealing with aging parents right now, and I'm still relatively young. And I'm like, okay, well, that idea of like money and meaning and how I spend my time has really been really clear, very clear to me now with that. So I love that I love that you're doing a poll on it to get people from around the world. You said, I think.
Correct. Yes. Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Fantastic. I'm going to go there. So moneyandmeaningbook.com.
Yes.
I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us for the session.
I love it.
It was so much fun. Oops, I muted myself by accident. I'm too excited. I had lots of light bulb moments. Even though I read the book, our conversation really led to some light bulb moments, and that's always my favorite conversations. So Sho will be joining us over on the Lead Dev Slack channel, where he'll be taking some more questions. If you have more questions, please put them over there. Head over to the Bookmarked channel where that'll be taking place. Thanks again for joining us.